son was 3, he became sort of infatuated with the idea of a grand finale we have here, but he insisted on calling it the Great Fratale, which sounded like a circus performer, like a little guitar swinging through the air. So I present to you the Great Fratale of the day. Sorry. So this is the second half of legalization and access. Our first speaker, sorry, while I get to my notes. Our first speaker is Xinping who is a current LLM, congratulations, a graduated LLM from Harvard Law School, who will present the paper Legal Pathways to Promote Access to Safe and Effective Psychedelic Medicines.
Hi everyone. We have been on quite a journey exploring the psychedelics from all different angles during the conference today. I'm Xinping Hu. I want to thank you to my great co-authors, Chris, Alison, and Holly for their great contribution along the way. And also want to thank you to our organizers for this informative conference. As we have seen throughout this conference, psychedelics offer potentially transformative benefits to mental health treatment. And the key question arises, how can we balance the goal for patient access with the robust evidence of safety and efficacy? It's a tricky balance, right? You want to make sure that those drugs will be safe and effective, while on the other hand, you don't want to keep it out of reach from those who urgently need it. And it's also a tough spot for doctors as well. As Dr. Kim pointed out, and also many other doctors, they want to help their patients, but in the meantime, they don't feel comfortable prescribing the drugs without real clinical trial data behind it. So to tackle this question and to achieve this balance, we have a wild journey through many different access pathways and to find the challenges and opportunities behind them. So we have got classic clinical trials, which is typically free for participants and also very great for generating data of safety and efficacy, but it's limited in eligibility and scale. And let's face it, not anyone is happy about the possibility of placebo. And expanded access is like a cool cousin of clinical trials. We have high authorization reach, streamlined access, and it's designed to not mess up with the ongoing clinical trials. However, it still depends on the company's willingness to provide the drugs, and not many doctors know about it. And we also have right to try, which sounds perfect on paper, but it doesn't provide safety measures that we can count on. And don't even get me started with medical tourism and illicit market. It's like a wild west out there. They do provide access to some, but without quality control, with no safety measures, and with no data collection. And here is something really interesting happen, that is state and local drug policy reforms. Like Colorado and Oregon, the states are trying to take measures into their own hands with licensed psychedelic facilities. It's a bold move, we have to recognize. However, it also raises up a bunch of questions like, how can we make sure those facilities are operating consistently and safely? What about the fact that they are still federally illegal? And how can we make sure those services are effective, not harmful? So we try to put together a table detailing all the pros and cons. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but I highly recommend you to go through our paper and get the full scope. So our key finding here is FDA approval is still the gold standard because it protects the research ecosystem, it ensures the rigorous testing, and it paves the way for the most equitable and broadest access. Sure, there is challenges like how can you create a blinded research with a psychedelic experience, and which system we should implement as evidence. But that is Mr. Schimber's paper's focus. And we are also open to interim access pathways, but we want to make sure that those programs are designed to complement, not hinder the FDA approval. That's why we highly appreciate state research fundings and research projects and study initiative studies. And that's echoing with Dr. King. So we didn't pull all of this out of thin air. We actually take a look at real life examples like medical marijuana to see what we can learn from them. So medical marijuana, on one hand, is a model of drug liberalization, but on the other hand, it's a cautionary tale of what can happen when you bypass the FDA approval. So you end up with a patchwork of state laws, inconsistent quality. Like in Maine, data from 2023 said there are 42% of medical marijuana cannot attain the contaminant standard. And also, good luck to find the insurance to cover it. And another lesson is when states rush to greenlight access, they will put a brake on the incentives to do the research to suss out who's going to benefit and how. And another lesson here we want to highlight is the hurdles researchers faces during their study. So a new law just got passed in 2022 called Medical Marijuana and Cannabidiol Research Expansion Act. Intends to streamline the research process of medical marijuana. So this law, for example, it requires HHS to review the current policy, which may be inhibiting the research in medical marijuana, and also propose suggestions to mitigate these barriers. And that is what we think can be an example for psychedelics as well. Because when scientists spending more time jumping through all the hoops instead of analyzing data, everyone loses. And here comes our second example, that is COVID-19 convalescent plasma. For those who are not familiar, this therapy involved taking blood from a patient who recovered from an infection and transfusing it into a current patient who is fighting the same virus. And the idea is the antibodies of the donated plasma can help them to fight off the virus. It was hailed as a potential game changer in the early days of COVID-19. But because we are so rushed to provide it to patients, many scientifically important steps were missed. And so we end up with, we cannot sure how well it works and for whom. It's a stark reminder of the importance of rigorous science, especially when we are eager for a solution. And the other example we want to study here is Robertson, which is FDA-approved psychedelic adjunct substance. So we probably know its original cousin is ketamine. So ketamine has shown promise as an antidepressant years ago, and many doctors has probably prescribed it for its papers off-label. However, because its patent has expired, so the companies doesn't have the incentive to bring it to the market as an antidepressant, they invented a newer and patented version called esketamine. However, it's way more expensive than the original version, and we don't have head-to-head study to prove that it's more effective. So in addition to the first lesson we learned here is patent protection is actually a very powerful incentive for the companies to do the research and bring alternative treatment options into the market. However, we also realize that the downside of relying too heavily of a patent-based system is higher cost and potentially limited accessibility, and undermining the goal of equitable access. So in addition to the necessary reform in IP law, like proposed by Dr. Shams and other professors, we also propose some alternative options, like direct public funding towards clinical trials, and also tax credit and much more. So here we have some recommendations for policymakers. The first is, let's keep our eyes on our winner, that is FDA approval. So FDA approval is still the best choice to provide safe, effective, and equitable access to psychedelics. And while we explore alternative avenues to responsibly expand access to of psychedelics to those who urgently need. We want to make sure those programs are designed to complement, not hinder FDA approval. And thirdly, let's provide what the researchers need to do their stuff. So we can provide serious public resources for them, for their clinical trials, and we can also remove barriers that frequently slow their study process. So by analyzing the success and failures from analogous contexts, and by prioritizing FDA approval, and in the meantime, carefully considering the alternative options like expanded access and state reforms, we can unlock the transformative potential of psychedelics while minimizing risks. Thank you for your attention.
Victoria.
I really appreciate your talk. I'm wondering how you can account for, like, if you kind of like just write off the illicit market in the first slide and you're like, FDA is the way we should focus. But right now, like a huge majority of people in the country are using psychedelics in unregulated frameworks. And that's kind of like the factual reality on the ground. So how do you reconcile that? Like if we put all of our focus on the FDA pathway, then are we just ignoring like risks? Like, I don't know, I may not agree with your assessment that the illicit market is like, like as, you know, we've seen harms occur in the regulated market too, right? And in the FDA research context. But I think like, yeah, harm reduction in terms of how people are actually accessing it, which right now is not the regulated frameworks.
Yes, it's such a wonderful question. So I would say, so even after those state reforms, we can still see, like in medical marijuana, illicit market cannot be eliminated. It still exists. So on one hand, I would say potentially we need to accept it as a reality because some people need to use more affordable choice for their treatment. But on the other hand, what we want to emphasize in our paper is we still want to provide the FDA approval because it can achieve to a broadened access and it can help more patients compared with the illicit market.
What is that based off? Like, are there numbers where you're like, well, how many people have insurance and the cost of therapy? And I respect the argument. I'm just like, maybe there's room for multiple pathways if the goal is widespread access, and the FDA pathway just for certain groups of people, or I'm just not sure, like you can make that claim without numbers.
Yes, so what I can respond is, once FDA approve a drug, like Medicare and Medicaid, they will reimburse the payment for those drugs. So I think that can pave the affordable way that you can get a drug for your conditions. But I actually don't have number yet to justify.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Christoph.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to share again a little bit idiosyncratic, perhaps European perspective that I hear from both the Netherlands and from Switzerland, where we have these practices, where we have a medical practice in somehow gray areas, and they both say, oh, perhaps it's not that bad if the things do not get approved. Because this will come with much more regulation, prices will go higher, we will have labeling, problematic, perhaps restriction of the kind of who can administer these treatments. In this gray area situation, we can know very fine, we can roll out the treatment, and it's, from an ethical perspective, it might be even better if it doesn't get approved. So that's perhaps an interesting addition to the problem.
Yes. I actually have some data from medical marijuana programs. So for example, there are some people seeking medical marijuana for their mental health conditions. However, data shows there are only 0.8% conditions listed in state programs are actually effective. So there are high possibility that you use the drugs provided by like state or other programs which is not effective for your conditions. However, through the FDA approval, the efficacy can be evidence-based, even though that might need help from Dr. Xinping. But I would say the efficacy and effectiveness has a higher possibility to achieve through FDA approval. And also, through FDA approval, the medical record of drug using can be located in your medical record. But in state medical marijuana programs, 90% of patient usage cannot be recorded. So your PCPs or other doctors may not know that you are using those drugs. So I think there are higher risks when you choose other pathways compared with the FDA approval.
Eduardo.
So adding to this conversation, I think I agree a bit with Victoria that the FDA pathway is not that clearly maybe the best. First, because of the issues I mentioned this morning, if the FDA really follows the idea of drug efficacy and approving a drug without psychotherapy, I worry that this may cause lots of harms and not really be effective for the general population. And second, the issue of price. It's still unclear to me and many people in this space what will be the business model to make the usual very high profit of the pharmaceutical industry for patients that will take their medication 3 to 5, 6, or maybe 10 pills in 1 year and a half. And as much as they charge for that, the more incentive there is for underground and other models to really give accessibility for the population. So both are interrelated, and one can increase because of the limitations imposed by the other.
I'm not sure if I understand right. So the first concern is effectiveness, and the second one is affordable, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So for the first one, I would say so from based on our study, we still think FDA approval can attain the highest level of effectiveness. I'm not sure this aligns with your research, but compared with current state medical marijuana program, we still think FDA approval can be stronger in ensure the effectiveness. And in terms of affordable, I would say, for example, I use esketamine here, but actually the drug company has figured out many ways to lower the price. So they have a program to provide esketamine to patients at a minimum at $10, so which is even more affordable than ketamine itself. So I would say there are still many other ways that can provide affordable drug choices through FDA approval, no matter it's through state budget, like what we are seeing in Connecticut. They are use the state money to help the patients to get in the expanded access program, or can be efforts from the companies. We can still find a way through the FDA approval. Thank you. I'm not sure, Chris, do you have anything to add?
Do we have time?
Yeah.
I just emphasize, I guess part of the story about the FDA that's so important is that it produces knowledge, it produces information about what does work and what doesn't work. And that's the real challenge about figuring out, something that's in the illicit market, for example, whether it actually does work for a given medical indication. And so the FDA is our regulatory mechanism to produce that knowledge. And the second thought is we really are limiting our focus here to a medical frame, right? We're thinking about how to use this as a treatment, which is of course not to exclude other frames or other purposes by which it can be used. But I think the third piece is just, I don't think this chapter is a very strong argument per se, so much as an analysis of the different pathways for which access happens.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Before I introduce Louis, so just maybe as an FDA nerd myself, what I find myself wondering throughout the day is, what does that REMS look like? And do we have opinions about what it should look like? Or do we know enough to think about that? So maybe that's a charge for the future. But next, I want to introduce Louis Grossman. He is the Anne Loeb Bronfman Professor of Law and Affiliate Professor of History at Washington College of Law at American University, presenting lessons from cannabis, envisioning a better regulatory structure for psychedelic therapies.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to listen to all of you today and an honor to participate in this event. Mine is a combination analytical piece, proposal piece, based on an analysis of a comparison of the medical marijuana landscape and the psychedelics landscape and what it might become. So if you think about the medical marijuana landscape now, it's a relatively small market for highly regulated synthetic or highly purified, isolated, FDA-approved cannabinoids, and relatively little research in this area. And this coexists with a booming market for botanical medical marijuana products with little support for their claims and little regulation of their production and labeling. Now, this situation is a legal construct. At the federal level, FDA, DEA, Justice Department officials, and Congress have all played a role in creating this landscape, in some instances by applying a very heavy regulatory hand, and in others by not regulating cannabis products at all. And this inconsistent federal policy is layered over the proliferation of state legalization, and that has led to the present state of affairs. At this moment, lawmakers and regulators may have an opportunity to design a regulatory approach to psychedelics that avoids some of the shortfalls of the medical marijuana regime. And let me start by saying that one thing I suggest in the paper is that there should be a pause in state legalization. This would preserve the industry's incentive to generate the safety and effectiveness data necessary to obtain FDA approval and patients' incentives to participate in clinical trials. Does that mean I'm calling for all-out criminalization? No, but I think there's some nuance there. The main statutes that lay behind the current construct are the Controlled Substances Act and the Food and Drug Act. And let me just start with the Controlled Substances Act. Schedule I status, which all psychedelics currently have, except for ketamine, which is arguably not a psychedelic, it makes it very difficult, both administratively and financially, to research a substance and to obtain the substance for research. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned yet today, I don't think, is that the states have their own Controlled Substances Acts, and these add another layer of regulatory burden and cost to research on Schedule I substances. Marijuana was long trapped in what was known as a catch-22. It was in Schedule I because it had, quote unquote, no currently accepted medical use, but it was hard and sometimes impossible to do the research necessary to establish such a accepted medical use because it was in Schedule I. You may have heard that rulemaking to reschedule marijuana to Schedule III is now in process, and it is based on a new test for currently accepted medical use, which, unlike the old test, which required either FDA approval or adequate and well-controlled trials at the level of those necessary to gain FDA approval, says that you can escape Schedule I if you show widespread current experience with medical use by licensed care providers in accordance with implemented state-authorized programs, it's a lot of words, and some credible scientific support. So how can psychedelics escape the catch-22? Supply, as I explain in my paper, is somewhat less of a problem for psychedelics than it was for marijuana. But the Controlled Substances Act still imposes significant burdens on psychedelic research, and researchers report that the extra layer of state regulation imposes significant burdens and delays. The new test for getting out of Schedule 1 by showing a currently accepted medical use is of no help at this point to psychedelics, because it seems like it's almost been designed just for marijuana, because it requires widespread use in accordance with state approved regulatory medical regimes. At this point, there is either 0 or 1 or 2 states that would qualify for that. So wholesale rescheduling of psychedelics under the new standard ain't gonna happen. What are some possible solutions? One that I have started to think about is the preemption of duplicative state-controlled substances act requirements for psychedelics. It's just an unnecessary added layer of cost and complication. In addition, Senators Booker and Paul have repeatedly introduced something called the Breakthrough Therapy Act, which would automatically switch any Schedule I substance to Schedule II if FDA either grants it what is known as breakthrough therapy designation, which is true for both MDMA and for psilocybin, or, and I think this is important, if FDA approves an expanded treatment access regime, that is a pre-approval access regime. At this point, any physician administering Schedule I psychedelics as part of a compassionate use program must obtain DEA Schedule I researcher registration, which is a serious inhibitor to these compassionate use programs. The Breakthrough Therapy Act would help solve those issues. I want to spend the rest of my limited time talking about botanical psychedelics versus synthetic psychedelics as illustrated by the medical marijuana situation. Getting a botanical drug approved by FDA is very difficult. That's because FDA imposes chemistry, manufacturing, and control requirements on substances that are being researched to ensure proper characterization and quality and consistency in the substance at both the IND stage and at the NDA stage. So unsurprisingly, in the marijuana sphere, only synthetic THC drugs have been approved, as well as one purified cannabis-derived drug, CBD, Epidiolex, which has been mentioned earlier today. Nobody has submitted an NDA for a whole leaf or whole bud product or an unpurified marijuana extract, and I don't think it's going to happen. So if you look at the psychedelics realm, there is a similar focus on synthetic substances. MDMA is a product of the laboratory. Compass, which is working toward an NDA for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, is, as has been mentioned earlier today, using a proprietary formulation of psilocybin developed in the lab. Another incentive for focusing development efforts on synthetics as well as FDA requirements is intellectual property. You can't obtain a composition of matter patent for a naturally occurring material. So what will be the respective roles of natural and synthetic psychedelic drugs in the future? There will always be a demand for natural products. There is a cult of the natural in the United States, where huge swaths of the population assume that a botanical or natural product is for some reason safer or better than a product of the laboratory. Many people embrace the notion of an entourage effect, where you can't just boil it down to one active substance, but it's the almost incalculable family of substances that does the work that a plant does. And of course, if you're looking at religious and spiritual uses, these are focused almost exclusively on plant materials rather than isolated substances from it. That said, pharmaceutical companies will always focus on synthetics to satisfy FDA CMC requirements, to obtain patent protection, and in the psychedelic space also because of the commercial viability of the crops. You can commercially viably raise cannabis. That is less clearly true for psilocybin mushrooms or iboga trees or peyote cacti. So looking forward, I think that there may be a future with a coexistence of paths where you have synthetic FDA-approved drugs for severe mental illness and other serious illnesses administered by professionals and covered by insurance, coexisting with natural psychedelics used for milder mental disorders, self-exploration, mind expansion, religious use, and traditional indigenous use. Now, where this leaves MDA and LSD, I haven't figured out yet. That can be something we talk about in the Q&A.
Go ahead.
Louis, I want to finish your penultimate sentence. I was with you until you said the word milder, right? So you were like saying coexistence paths with synthetic FDA-approved drugs by professionals for serious mental illness, along with, I think I heard you say, milder. And so I guess I want to ask why you think the other stuff is going to be milder, and also whether you think, and I'm just thinking about like the ICER calculation about what the cost of PAT might look like, whether the average person would look at that and say, you know what, thank you very much, but I want to consume on the street. I think that the market really is viable with the coexistence. And, so yeah.
And I mean, I think it hinges on insurance coverage, ultimately. I think that the average person would be willing to pay for a reliably produced, professionally administered psychedelic substance rather than going to the street or the dispensary if it was covered by insurance. Now, in terms of the milder thing, I mean, you caught me. I was just finishing the paper with some thoughts, and it may be an absolutely indefensible distinction. I mean, but what I was thinking of was that a lot of people use medical cannabis as basically an OTC product for, anxiety and things like that. And perhaps there's ultimately a role, especially if you think of microdosing, for natural psychedelics to treat those types of disorders which might not be covered by insurance the way that things like PTSD and treatment-resistant depression would be. But I'm really making shit up at the end of this paper. But I'm just trying to imagine.
You're a good company.
Louis, I'll ask a question about something you touched on in your paper, which is the confusing puzzle of FDA regulators working with state practice boards around the therapy, and how you think that, what's that going to look like? How do those discussions even happen, and what comes out the other end?
Well, I mean, this is a nice bridge to your question about REMS, which I don't really talk about at all in the paper. It's important to understand that the way that the REMS provisions of the Food and Drug Act are currently written, they are required to be addressed at a specific risk. The statute is not written in a way where you can impose a REMS to increase efficacy. I think it might be a good idea to revise the Food and Drug Act as it was revised, by the way, with respect to phase 4 studies, to embrace situations where the REMS can be used to ensure efficacy. And you could make the argument that when you're talking about suicidality, the line between efficacy and safety blurs. But imposing something like adjuvant, psychotherapy in the way that many people think is necessary here is just not currently within FDA's legal power, and it's also not within its traditional role. And so then the question is, well, how do we ensure that this FDA-approved drug is being administered in a way that is effective with the concomitant therapy? And the only way to really do that is in conjunction with the states and the medical associations. And how will that be done? I mean, FDA has worked with all kinds of stakeholders in its life. I think it'll just have to be creative, and I don't really have any mechanical answers to your question.
Matthew.
Louis, great talk. Do you anticipate that we'll ever move to a situation where the FDA or another federal agency will regulate the non-therapeutic use of psychedelics? And I kind of see this in the context of this just growing multidisciplinary sort of acceptance at the margins of things. I mean, maybe starting with, erectile dysfunction, where you make up this disorder which has a drug, testosterone replacement therapy now, Ozempic with off-label use just to get rid of those last 5 or 10 pounds, all kinds of use of, call it what you will, like non-therapeutic or just optimization. This is not going to stop. And it's hard for me to imagine that if we're around 100 years from now, that this isn't going to be regulated at the federal level. And at what point do we pretend that this kind of gray zone doesn't exist anymore? Or do you disagree with that assessment?
So it is indeed the case, and Patty Zettler, who some of you may know, has written about kind of like non-therapeutic uses of drugs. And there's a lot of them. I mean, minoxidil to grow hair. I mean, you can go on and on. And the question is whether the fact that this has to do with, mind altering puts it in a different category, or whether ultimately, FDA does regulate recreational drugs now. It does so by banning them, right? I mean, it's now illegal. But the definition of drug it includes things that are intended to affect the structure or function of the body. But with respect to recreational drugs, FDA's attitude up to now has been, okay, so you're dispensing nitrous oxide in bags at a rock concert, that's illegal, and we're banning it. I don't know why not. I think it would take a societal shift. I think it would take some negotiation between DEA and FDA regarding what their respective roles are. But I'd like to see that. Why not?
Chris, last question.
I would just put tobacco and caffeine in that last analysis you were just doing, seeing how they're treated a little differently by FDA.
Yeah. And by the way, somebody said, I think it was Iowa said yesterday, caffeine is a food. It's also a drug. It's called no-dose. So it's actually a liminal product rather than just a food.
And regulated as medicine in the OTC form.
Yeah.
Nicotine as well.
And nicotine as well is regulated now both as a recreational product and as a medical product.
Great. Oh, Leonard, you get the last word.
Louis, loved your talk. Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Oh, great. Let's see, in 55, Gordon Wasson, the banker, visited what? Let that
Okay, so I've stopped hearing you, I'm sorry.
Hello. In 1955, the banker Gordon Wasson visited Huatla de Jemez in Oaxaca to speak to the curandera Maria Sabina about her mushroom cult. And he took the mushroom back to Albert Hoffman, who extracted the active principle, psilocybin, named it, synthesized it. that went back to Maria. She used it in the ceremonies and said, the spirit is the same. So the question really for you is, in terms of many startups that we're seeing these days that have heavily invested claims in the entourage effect, do you think these will be displaced by a pure active pharmaceutical ingredient that is demonstrated as efficacious? Do you think the entourage arguments will eventually go away?
So certainly, when it comes to spiritual and religious uses, I think we heard earlier today that, I forget the phrase she used, the spirit is the same. Is that what you said? I don't think that everyone would agree the spirit is the same when it comes to an isolated, purified, or synthetic ingredient versus the entire plant.
Well, that was only Maria speaking. Right?
Yeah. So, but you're asking me whether I think that ethos will ever take over. And, if you look at Marinol and marijuana, Marinol is an FDA-approved drug for nausea accompanying either chemotherapy or AIDS HIV. And it's not a very successful drug. And you can come up with various reasons why it's not a very successful drug, but one of them is the entourage effect, which some people embrace. Another is the mode of delivery, because it's not inhalable, and some people, think that inhalable control is necessary for an effective use of this product. So, I guess one of those observations is relevant to your question, the other's not. But I think there are a lot of people who truly embrace the entourage effect with respect to cannabis, which has like 125 or 150 cannabinoids. I don't know enough about the chemistry of psychedelics to know whether the entourage effect has the same scientific basis. There are people who talk about the entourage effect when it comes to psychedelics, but I just don't know whether whether the experience of taking psilocybin versus eating a psychedelic mushroom, a magic mushroom, is different. The way that people insist that smoking marijuana is different from taking marijuana. I don't know. Do you know?
Well, it varies with the molecule. Marinol is regarded as ambiguous, kind of a psychedelic wash, not very interesting. Whereas actual cannabis has strong flashes of very, very unusual effects. In terms of crystalline psilocybin and mushroom, it would be hard to differentiate between the two. So with that group, there is no entourage effect. Well, we're seeing claims as well with ibogaine, the root bark extract versus the pure GMP, good manufacturing practice material, claims that they're entirely different. And so whole industries are being built on extracts, certain chemicals in ibogaine extracts, ibogaine, for example. The debate rages.
Thank you. Sorry, got the timer going. So our final speakers today, sharing the time to present on interrogating calls for access and equity in the psychedelics industry. Nishay Demno is a senior lecturer in the university writing program at Johns Hopkins Krieger School of Arts and Sciences and an affiliated researcher at Poplar at Petrie-Flom. And Ifratayo Harvey is the executive director of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective and an affiliated researcher also at Poplar at Petrie-Flom. Take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be here. In our paper, I explored the connections between race, class, and drug policy through my analysis of psychedelic capitalism, the current guiding force behind psychedelic research and regulation. Specifically, this approach, which is most popular in the psychedelic field, aims to integrate psychedelics into the status quo for-profit models that make up healthcare and wellness industries. The marketability of psychedelics and wellness is rooted in the racialized and class drug hierarchy. To understand this, we must understand the racialized history of the United States' early drug laws. At the turn of the 20th century, drug laws grew from a reactionary response to working class immigrants and people of color in parts of the United States to a global policing strategy approach, proving that no one has won the war on drugs. Despite the industry's claims, true wellness cannot be a for-profit business model. With the increased mainstreaming of psychedelics, capitalist systems are prioritizing profit at the expense of healing. Under capitalism, the wellness and mental health industries will manufacture psychedelic substances into marketable products. In doing so, these dominant approaches perpetuate the same systems that underlie many of the problems that drive people to need healing. In our paper, I also explain how the new phenomenon of psychedelic capitalism is ultimately the latest iteration of the war on drugs, since it is perpetuating capitalism's exploitive origins along with the drug war's racist motivations. So some of the sources that I've used to support these claims are Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. In Black Marxism, Robinson narrates the origins of capitalism to racial oppression, where he says that the historical development of world capitalism was influenced in the most fundamental way by the particular forces of racism and nationalism. So one could examine how the institution of slavery in the US or the New World used enslaved people's bodies to build capital. And some folks would argue that slavery never actually ended in this country. Another source I look at is one in the Shade's papers, is right-wing psychedelia cases in cultural plasticity and political pluripotency. Because there's this notion in the field and among enthusiasts that psychedelics make one more progressive or a better person, when in reality, fascists, members of the political right wing, warmongers, wealthy conservatives use psychedelics. And in this paper, Nishay talks about how the wealthy's enthusiasm for psychedelics should not be taken as promise to enact pro-sociality. Instead, their enthusiasm for psychedelics suggests that this class of drugs is not inherently a solution for ameliorating the extensive harms caused by social inequality. And I think another problem that we're faced with is we are treating individual symptoms rather than calling for societal reorganization. And because the field is attempting to integrate psychedelics into dysfunctional and destructive systems, or what I call a burning house, as opposed to dismantling the systems, many working in the field fail to envision healing processes beyond symptom management. Another source that I look at is moving forward by looking back critiques of commercialized mindfulness and of the future of commercialized psychedelics. So in this paper, they compare the commercialization of mindfulness to what is to be the commercialization of psychedelics. And they argue that through commercialization, we lessen the efficacy of mindfulness and psychedelics. Time's running out. The last thing I want to mention is a piece by Sean Vigna and Amanda Stevens on minorities' diminished returns. And this piece shows that without working to curb the harmful systems of oppression, like racism and classism, the outcomes of psychedelic therapy may not have a positive impact, especially for people of color. Every layer of structural oppression counteracts the positive long-term effects of psychedelic therapy, and they illustrate how race factors into psychedelic therapy, showing that white people have access to set and setting privileges that appear to create some benefits of psychedelic uses, while Black people gain nothing. So,
thanks. I'm just going to continue there by starting with the point that the psychedelic industry has been calling for the urgency of increased psychedelic access for minority groups. But access, we argue, is dangerous when harmful healing ideologies are so widely accepted and unexamined in the broader field. Psychedelic exceptionalism, as defined by Matthew Johnson, is one of the greatest sources of harm that I have been seeing. It overlooks the danger of psychedelics as cultogenic. They have an explicit history of giving rise to cultish groups. In Matt's definition, he says that the belief that psychedelics are so sacred and important that the normal rules of ethics and clinical practice do not apply. But this is paired with insufficient attention to the fact that during decades in the underground, many of these groups were insulated from outside scrutiny of their practices. Many of those practices are already associated with predictable patterns of harm that will disproportionately impact vulnerable groups if they scale with endorsement from government regulators. To address these risks, we have to pay attention to abuses of power in the field itself. We need to change the field's norms so that people with important perspectives can come forward. To help illustrate what I mean, I'll very quickly share some of my experiences of challenging Lycose's application at the recent FDA advisory committee meeting where Ife Tayo also spoke. In my analysis that I submitted to the FDA, I argue that MAPS qualifies as a therapy cult with an overly rigid healing ideology. The full analysis is on my Substack in a post titled MAPS is an MDMA therapy cult if you'd like to know more of the details. I presented evidence that MAPS obscured its actual therapy protocol from regulators, and that this undisclosed protocol introduces unexamined and unnecessary risks. The takeaway is that MAPS's healing ideology encourages boundary violations, and it introduces a vocabulary that invalidates participant articulations of harm. This creates a high risk of re-traumatization, especially for those with trauma related to invalidation, including racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+ individuals, and people who have experienced sexual assault and coercive control. In the week after I submitted my analysis to the FDA, 3 separate predictions that I made based on close reading descriptions of their healing ideology were confirmed. Multiple participants told me my analysis validated their experiences of harm. They shared that MAPS-trained therapists had conditioned them to believe that they were at fault for new traumas that those therapists caused. So far, the broader field has not acknowledged these risks in the post-advisory committee commentary. But a few days ago, I was singled out in an open letter published by multiple veterans groups. These groups have received significant funding by the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative. The letter, which is full of inaccuracies, includes, quote, Ms. Devno and her colleagues at ICER and Symposia have successfully manipulated the media and infiltrated the FDA's regulatory process to the detriment of millions. They may single-handedly dash the hopes of thousands of veterans who continue to take their own lives due to their suffering from PTSD. Today, writing in Ecstatic Integration, Jules Evans identified how this rhetoric is dangerous. He wrote, quote, this PR strategy is pretty unpleasant in its targeting of one woman. It might even be unsafe if you're telling desperate and occasionally armed veterans, this woman is wishing you hate and perpetuating your suffering, end quote. Nonetheless, this open letter was shared by major funders in the psychedelic industry, including Tim Ferriss, Steve Robertson, and David Bronner. Many of these investors are associated with the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative. At least one of them even funded Poplar here at Harvard's Petrie-Flom. This is ultimately why I spoke up, because people are afraid, because the industry has a history of making examples of people who talk about harm. That is why I needed to be a proxy for whistleblowers in the first place. And ultimately, it should not be on individuals to deal with these dynamics. The field can speak up and not require me to take all of this threat to my personal safety. Ethicists can help by acknowledging the validity of part of my analysis, for example, and actually addressing it, rather than focusing on the easier to excuse aspects like functional blinding. And I think that the more that we do that, the more we'll have other perspectives to drive the field forward in a way that is not putting the greatest harms on the most vulnerable patients. Thank you.
Leonard.
Nishay, do you think it would be best to, if one has a critique of an organization, to approach the organization privately and discuss how to reform their approaches or their research or their techniques? Or is it better to go online and go public with a critique first?
Ultimately, I have been doing my critical work for very many years, and I needed to start becoming, because I study, in the beginning I wanted to study trib reports. I'm a literary scholar, and I have things that I would rather be doing with my time, frankly, than talking about these critical safety issues. But I have noticed over the years, trying to raise these issues privately, that I was, and other people who also tried to speak up, were systematically marginalized and excluded from the conversations. And so for the field to look at those who have been excluded and marginalized, speaking up at a very high stakes time when there's an attempt to scale these practices and trying to say, it's important that we do this right from the beginning, because we might not get a second chance. I think that that's completely valid given the circumstances, but I do speak in private, but those conversations haven't been public. You know, I definitely tried that.
I wanted to, for either Tara or Nishay, I wanted to just offer you an opportunity to say a little bit more about the idea of psychedelic capitalism as a continuation of the war on drugs. I found that idea very interesting and provocative. And also just to sketch a little bit about, I think I know what you mean by psychedelic capitalism, what the alternative would be, but just to invite you to say a few more words about it.
Yes, so the question is, explain a little bit more about what psychedelic capitalism is, and then...
The idea that it's the latest stage of the war on drugs. I found that idea really, really interesting.
Yes, so I say it was a challenge presenting all this in 5 minutes, so I didn't get to, So I'll say that psychedelic capitalism purports to bring healing to the masses while refusing to acknowledge how the complex system of globalized capitalism is at the heart of suffering and trauma. And at the beginning, I shared about, how the institution of enslavement was the foundation of capitalism. And for me, as someone who's 5 generations removed from that, I think a lot of people try to skirt around and say, well, can we make a more conscious capitalism? In my paper, I reference David Bronner's piece on conscious capitalism, and there's no way around it. It is inherently that. So I think we see a lot of people trying to, conscious capitalism or sacred capitalism are things that I've seen. In terms of what needs to be done, I think that we can advocate for psychedelics, but we also have to advocate for, creating a social safety net, actually trying to bring about material changes, and also advocate for life-saving policies in conjunction with advocating for psychedelics. So that paper that showed that Black people had or received little to no effect after taking psychedelics, part of the reason why is because nothing has changed materially for us. We don't have universal health care, we don't have sick leave housing for all, universal basic income, reparations, all those things play a role in how psychedelics can help people or not make a difference at all.
Could I say one quick thing in response to that too? Yeah, in my psychedelic hype/AI hype paper called Test Real Hallucinations, I talk about how the industry has really engaged in a bait and switch over many years, where it's like they're saying, don't question what we're doing, we have to move quickly and break things because this is so important to address climate change and rising rates of political polarization and rising fascism and devastating impacts on mental health, when all of those things are actually connected to rising rates of inequality in society. So if we actually make an industry that's just creating new billionaires and new unicorn corporations, that's actually fueling the root cause of the problems that we're talking about in the first place. And that's an important aspect of the conversation.
I see Robert, Logan, and Andrew. We're going to see if we can do all three. Maybe we can get all the questions and then have a final set of responses.
I guess you kind of touched on it there, the comment on societal reorganization as being what's needed. It seems to me that we have a bunch of symptoms. The anxiety, the depression are just symptoms of broader disorders that are poverty, economic instability, and all the other wider issues. And a lot of the sort of looking at cannabis to address the war on drugs or psychedelics to address like injuries to indigenous people, it seems that it's just a way to shift this and to, from the previous talk too, we can exercise these ghosts that haunt us for our bad behavior rather than really making the much larger systemic investments and changes. And my question is really, how do we shift the dialogue from you're going to donate a portion of your profits to this to we need to really address this on a broader scale?
Okay to do all three questions. That'd be great. Okay. Logan.
First off, I want to thank you both for sharing Ipatayo. I'm really big on that idea that we're not going to dose people out of this problem using psychedelics, and that the environments they live in are contributing to their problems in the first place. And that to Eduardo's talk earlier, the effectiveness is not going to be there if they're going back to disadvantaged environments. So thank you for that. My question though is for Nishay, and it's on the point of psychedelic exceptionalism. I'm sorry you've been experiencing what you have, but for psychedelic exceptionalism, I'm wondering how we can distinguish between the exceptionalism you're referring to about we don't need to adhere to the normal rules of clinical ethics, et cetera, because they're sacred, because they are, we have this sort of spiritual mission with them, as opposed to a psychedelic, more sober psychedelic exceptionalism that also acknowledges that they're not the same as other drugs, and our way of talking about drugs in this country is problematic and conducive to some of the issues we're experiencing with RCT being the gold standard for understanding efficacy, because there's a specific drug effect of each molecule and so on and so forth. So curious your thoughts on treading that line.
And Andrew.
Yeah, I think what is interested in getting these either examples, either in practice or theoretically of of alternative models or sort of like resistance to either the war on drugs or psychedelic capitalism that maybe strike that sort of may show a path forward towards something that is a little bit more sort of politically active and something that is actually transformational. Something that's bubbled up in resistance to the model that you're
I can address Andrew and Robert's question quickly. Robert, I think you said, how do we shift the dialogue from we're going to give a percentage of the profits to something else? And I think there are some examples that we can look at in cannabis and larger drug policy reform. In New York's cannabis law, there were reparative justice components written into the bill. So they looked at all of the neighborhoods in New York, and they were able to find the data to show which neighborhoods have been the most impacted by cannabis prohibition and stop and frisk. And so they wrote in the bill that a percentage of the profits from the legal market were to be reinvested into those communities, which I think is a really cool thing. The unfortunate thing is when we get to the implementation stage, a lot of the, local, state politicians tend to, sabotage. And that's what's happening in New York right now. The state kind of turned their back and allowed all these unlicensed cannabis dispensaries to open up all over New York City as a way of thwarting the efforts to reinvest the taxable money back into the communities. So I think it's an example, but it's also a lesson for advocates to remember that even if you write something in a policy, it can still be sabotaged or just taken away or not fully work out because of state and local politics.
And just to answer the question about the psychedelic exceptionalism, I think it really relates to what I was talking about regarding the field's hostility to critique. And this actually comes up in like meditation, adverse event discourse as well, where it's like there's, in both fields, there's certain groups that are too tightly held onto lineages of ideologies of healing that cannot be interrogated or questioned, even when they are the source of the harms. So it's like we need to be able to have those questions and put forward hypotheses and scientific questions that can be like tested empirically. But then when people are saying, I'm experiencing this harm and pointing to like, this is why that happened and we can address this and it's not necessary, like those people, right now they're seen as threats to the millions of veterans whose blood will now be on their hands, like explicitly. Whereas like the field that I want to build thanks those people for coming forward. Thank you for sharing. You have helped us like with looking on the beach for metal, like you helped us find something that we can actually make safer so this doesn't need to happen again. And that is an overlooked component of healing. Because when people are able to take their suffering and their distress and do something meaningful with it to make the world safer for others, that can help them process their experience as well. And we're currently overlooking that whole aspect to healing.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking this panel.